On this beautiful Saturday morning. Finally, we are out of the rains a little bit, and hopefully spring is going to come to us soon. And then you can test um, your beekeeping skills to the fullest. Um, Today, I hope that everyone just received another email that I distributed earlier this morning with two photographs on it concerning uh, bee feeders, the feeders that we use for feeding the bees, particularly in the fall season, but that could also be done, of course, in other times of the year. Anyway, I will go into that a bit later. So there are four main topics today. One of them has to do with the diseases that I was talking about last week. This very long discussion or this long monologue. It is a topic that, for better or worse, is something that most beekeepers like to ignore, but the reality of it is if you do, you end up losing your bees. So it's really important to pay close attention to that subject matter. And then the second issue is the integrated pest management approach. And I will talk about that as a second component of the presentation this morning. And then we will deal with fall and winter preparations. And last, to do something with bee legislation. A nice boring topic, but something that perhaps you may want to pay some heed to because we happen to be living in an environment where these things are a reality. With these diseases and pests, I provided you with a lot of information last week, and therefore you have, of course, the PowerPoint presentation in your that was distributed last week as well. And I hope you can go over that. You don't have to go over that all the time, but in the weeks to come, uh, it's important to differentiate between one thing and another. The most important ones to really look at and to be focused on is, of course, to do with this business of varroa mites and American foulbrood disease. And I would say that the third disease that tends to occupy beekeepers a lot is nosema. Um, the problem with the varroa mite is the fact that it is an extraordinarily virulent pest that will kill your bees. But the problem is it's not only that it has a very sophisticated life cycle, and it is not like a bacterium that is, a microbe that is very simplistic in its design. It is a sophisticated animal, if you will, that is not in an evolutionary sense. It's not equal to honeybees, of course, but it certainly is capable to fight its own battles, you might say. So the problem is that I recall in 1987, a long time ago, I attended a conference in in a conference in which researchers at the time, that was the year when we were getting varroa mites in Canada or in North America. I remember there was a German researcher who said, well, they have had their varroa mites already at the time for 9 years, and because it was introduced to Germany in 1978. And the researcher was saying, this is a tough animal to control because in the meantime, we have tested something in the order of 142 different products, chemicals to control varroa mites. And he said, yeah, some of them were working really well to control varroa mites. But in many cases, it would also control bees. In other words, it would kill the bees. And in some cases, if it would have been applied, it would also kill the beekeeper. And that is where the struggle is. A lot of people have asked over the years, why do we have so much difficulty to control varroa mites? It's because most of the chemicals, most of the materials that we like or that we think that we should apply will also have an impact on the bees. And it is that difficulty. All of us wish to have a deadly material available to kill off varroa mites and something that is totally benign and safe around bees. There are a lot of efforts, research efforts put into place right now to find some of these products. Many of them are not chemicals like the traditional pesticide by that definition. Most of the products that we have used, the proprietary products, are typically nerve poisons, and they affect the nervous system. So if we have one of the most popular ones available is Apivar, that is in a plastic strip, and it is impregnated, and you place that inside of the two frames in the brood chamber, and after 6 weeks of application, you can pull it out. But what does that thing do? Well, the Apivar, or the active ingredient, is called amitraz, is embedded in this plastic substrate, and it is a slightly porous substrate, you might say. And with the bees walking over it with their foot pads, they pick it up, and then they groom themselves and touch each other and everything else. And in that way, they distribute the toxin. And the toxin is not something that amitraz is recognized as an, quote, an insecticide. I mean, it does affect bees as well. And why does it affect varroa mites more than bees is because mites are much smaller and they have thinner cuticle. The cuticle is basically the exoskeleton, the skin, if you will, and the outside of the animal. And it penetrates through that skin or through that cuticle easier than the thicker skin of the honeybee. But and in that way you can control varroa mites. But it is not entirely benign to bees as well. And so that is what we will be talking about the integrated pest management. To complicate matters, varroa mites are no longer acting on their own. Research has shown that they carry viruses, and many of the bee viruses. Although mites may not be impacted by this, they carry these viruses and pass them on from bee to bee. And through their feeding habits, they introduce these viruses into the bee body. And I recall in the early 1980s, late 70s, 80s, British Columbia, the British Columbia government supported a very comprehensive queen rearing program it was carried out in an isolated spot along the coast out here in the Powell River district, and we were producing some very fabulous queens. And in order to have a comprehensive set of genes to work with, at that time, some queens were imported from New Zealand. And New Zealand was the only authorized, at that time, the only authorized overseas source from which we could get queens. And I recall after a couple of years, we had offspring and daughters from the selected queens. We got a request from an Australian researcher by the name of Dr. Dennis Anderson. He is now at the end of his career, but at that time he was still a young guy who he was actually an apicultural virologist. He specialized in working on viruses in bees. Keep that in mind. At that time, the whole business of PCR, the DNA analysis of, these techniques that are currently used today were not available at the time. It was a far more painstaking, long procedure in order to determine the presence of viruses in honeybees. Notwithstanding, some of these queens were sent back to Anderson in Australia, and he, sure enough, he confirmed the presence of Kashmir bee virus, or KBV, in some of the stock that we had produced out here, and that originated from New Zealand stock. At the time, we thought, well, that is kind of an interesting, this kind of an academic curiosity, if you will, more than anything, because we didn't really have any problem seeing any problems with any of the queens that were produced or the bees that were produced from these queens. But keep in mind, this was an era, the late or the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, when there were no varroa mites, there were no tracheal mites, there were no mites at all. We were still living and working in the age of innocence when it comes to beekeeping. Everything changed after 1987 when, in September of 1987, when the varroa mite was discovered in North America, and it was in September of 87, and would you believe it, 3 years later, in 1990, in late August of 1990, we discovered the first entry of varroa mites in British Columbia. Consider that varroa mites are flightless. They cannot live on their own, as I discussed last week. They are what they call an obligate parasite, and they cannot have other hosts either. So in other words, they're stuck. The only insect that they can really parasitize successfully is the honeybee. And so they are relatively immobile, and yet they were able to spread diagonally across the continent in a period of 3 years, which is quite remarkable. Biologically, it's a phenomenal story, but we pay the price for it, or the bees do, with all the colonies that die. And again, we have a dual problem out here. It's not only the terribly big impact that varroa mites have on the bees through direct parasitism and affecting the brood of bees. On top of it is the circulation and this introduction and circulation of various viruses, not just Kashmir bee virus, but deformed wing virus and black queen cell virus and so on. That is what complicates matters, and I will be talking about that shortly in the integrated pest management presentation. American foulbrood disease. I would encourage you to be as vigorous and as serious about controlling this disease as possible. Hygienic management is the key to all of this. American foulbrood disease will not only eventually kill the bees, but it also will render much of your equipment useless, because the scales, the spores that are left will reinfect, and you can, of course, infected equipment, you cannot sell it to a fellow beekeeper who will then end up with your souvenir. So be rigorous and critical about it. Someone sent me an email earlier this week asking about how do you inspect and everything else, and I distributed some information about all of this as well. When you go through your hive every 2 or 3 weeks just to check on them, what you do is you take your honey super off, if there are any honey supers on it, and you go, don't bother with the bottom box because you have already earlier in the season reversed them in early spring. So the empty box that had wintered is now going to be the second one. So you are managing the colony to have it all nicely put together, that you have this unit nicely growing. Okay. So when you go for your once every 2 or 3 week inspection, you open up that colony, you take the lid off, you take the inner cover off, and then you only have to select roughly 3 or 4 brood frames in the top super, in the top brood chamber, okay? You first take this frame out at the closest to you, close to the wall. That's virtually always empty in the sense there are hardly any bees walking on it. So you can take that thing out and you place that typically like this. Of course, this hive is a bit too small, but you place this behind it or at the side of it or on the other side like this, okay? Not flat on the ground, not like this, but always like this. So you don't squeeze any bees. So that is your empty frame that sits out there. And now you have enough room in that top chamber to move the frames around, and you slowly move the second frame and you can pull that out and have a look. You get through there, you have to look at the cluster, 3 or 4 frames, brood frames in that cluster. Don't worry about the queen. If you find eggs, larvae, and capped brood, you know that everything is peaceful. And you can close the hive again. You can put it back and everything is fine. But If you find something that you say, well, these cells don't look entirely good, then you will go into the next step by finding out, hey, what else is wrong here? Not only is there a visual component to it, there is also also use your other senses. For example, do the bees make a different sound? When the bees are happy and there's no disease and the queen is laying and everything is just hunky-dory, then the bees are kind of, you have a soft hum around that around that hive. So the bees are peaceful. They kind of ignore you. Okay? But when they are kind of finished, they walk over the frames fast and they are kind of uh, excited or edgy, if you will. That is mostly a signal. Something is wrong. And that could be anything. That could be a disease in there. It could be also that they have a shortage of food. It could be that they are being pestered by something like wasps or some disturbance of some sort. It could, of course, also be that the queen is failing. And then you may have to go through that colony a bit closer to have a look. What I mentioned earlier as well, when you look for eggs and larvae, you look straight into the cells, straight into the cells to confirm that indeed there are eggs in there. And you'll also look, are there any food reserves, like is there honey out here, is there pollen, all these kind of things you have to look for. For diseases, for American foulbrood disease, if you see some of those larvae being discolored instead of milky cream color, they're kind of brownish, then you go into it by saying, geez, is that something? And get into the habit of having in your breast pocket a few toothpicks and a small plastic sleeve or a piece of saran wrap or something. And when you find these cells, suspect cells, with a I put the large screen on that. Actually, that helps, wouldn't it? Let me just have a look which one that is actually. Aha. You will see that happen in a couple of minutes or a few seconds. When you have the total the brownish material, you take that with your toothpick and you get that, you pull that out and you put that in a plastic sleeve. You don't have to include the toothpick, but if it is kind of ropey, as I have in the display before, then you know that things are, that you have to put it into that plastic thing, put it in an envelope and mail it to us. For free, we will make sure that you will be able to get an answer fairly quickly, and then we can tell you it is American foulbrood disease or it is no worry at all. Beekeepers often become very excited about, I have a larger screen to show you and I don't know how to do this. Let me just see here. No, not this one. No. So I don't know why my screen is small out there. My apologies, I'm still here. At the end of the darn course, I'm still fidgeting around with this. I have to leave it this way. I do not know how to do it differently. So why is it doing what it's doing now? My apologies. I have to, I'm trying to do it as best as I can here. Notwithstanding, all what you have to do is send it in and then we analyze it. Keep in mind that honey queens can lay hundreds and hundreds of eggs every day. And particularly when you have that, now it's better. When you have a situation of perhaps temporary shortage of food, pollen particularly, sometimes the the brood will fail. Sometimes it's just not going to work perfectly. And as a result, you would have some of these cells dying out or dying, and therefore they discolor also. It doesn't mean that there is a disease. It is often very much related to the food reserves that are available in the area. Okay, so it is always fine to simply collect and sample and submit it for just to be on the safe side. Okay, I'm going to now try, since I'm mad at that now anyway, to get the an additional the IPM thing in place and see how that is going to work. Let me just see here. I have to, no, this baby here is the small one. And now let me just, no, we had this one last week. I will put this one up. Okay. So here we have integrated pest management. I hope that you had a chance to have a look at this thing a bit earlier last week. You know, it's interesting that often beekeepers get involved with a phrase that becomes popular a few years ago. Everybody started to talk about, oh, IPM this and IPM that. Most people didn't even know what the hell it meant. Integrated pest management, often it is also wrongly concluded that it is a management system to keep pests and diseases under control without chemicals. Not so. It's not true. What this is that we integrate a number of techniques to control a pest or a disease, to integrate them in such a way that we have a program that can basically little pieces of controls, none of which are strong enough or strong enough to control the disease, but the combination of them will be sufficient to control it. So that is essentially what it is. But before we get there, I have to give you a little bit of background as to how this all developed over time in the past. So here we are. When you have a product that you want to control a disease with, or for that matter, a medicine that you want to use because you had too much of a big party last night and now you have this massive headache, and it says on the bottle, oh, aspirins are great for hangover. I wouldn't say hangovers, but headaches. So you pop a couple of those, and that's it. But when you do that, that product is then supposedly helping to get rid of your headache. But it means that it doesn't mean that that is the only impact that it has. As you know, acetyl salicylic acid, the active ingredient of aspirin, is pretty harsh on your stomach and your stomach liner, and you know, you may have burns in your digestive tract as a result of an overuse of aspirin. So these are what we call contraindicators. And so if you apply a product, it doesn't mean that it just disappears. But there are basically three or so events that take place. It is either metabolized by the organism, let's say in this case the honeybee, you get some medicine into it, and it breaks it down in the process because it has the chemical sophistication to the chemistry, if you will, to be able to break it down. And it could be done chemically or physically, depends on what the control product is. But if the organism, like the honeybee, is not capable of doing anything, it will stay behind as a residue. Okay? And so often people tend to forget that they tend to focus primarily on, oh, this is what it fixes and that's the end of the story. No, you have to be very much more careful. And that is what I was mentioning earlier with amitraz, for example. That is a chemical that affects the nervous system, including potentially the nervous system of the honeybee. So with all these things, you have to be cautious to think through what the negatives are, what the negative impacts can be if you apply something that is supposedly helping to control your pest. And a good example that I have here at the bottom, it is also often that beekeepers, of course, in North America here have been using antibiotics to control American foulbrood disease, and and often for many years it has even been used prophylactically, where people just simply put it in whether they needed it or not. It's just convenient in the fall season. You just put a couple of spoonfuls of the stuff in your sugar syrup, and there you go. The problem is that if you use that continuously, what happens? I mentioned this last week. The antibiotics will kill off all the bugs in the digestive tract of the honeybee, and not only the bad ones, but the good ones as well. And many of the good ones are essential in breaking down the hard coating of pollen grains, inside of which we have the proteins that the bees need. And so if these good bugs are no longer there, much of the good nutrition of pollen goes straight through the system and is basically leaving the honeybee body again. So there are contraindicators, negatives associated with this kind of usage. So when we look, and by the way, this presentation is not exclusively directed towards honeybees, because we can use it in a larger context as well in agriculture. And before we have in recent years, people have become, justifiably so, very much critical about the conventional farm practices that have become common, particularly in North America and in Europe and in some other parts of the world. It was in the 1930s when the synthetic pesticides were developed and were introduced, many of which were pretty, so we say, harsh chemicals. But the problem is that the great advantage of it is that they were at a low cost, and they had minimal or no problems with ease of application. You just put it in the tank, you mix it up, and you drive the tractor through the field, and that's it. So with that, it was often more a kind of a calendar-based application system. That meant that if you were growing potatoes, you said after the seed potatoes were put into the ground, 3 weeks later you spray X. A month later you spray Y, and then just to get a defoliant in there, at the time of harvest you put the defoliant over the darn field, and all the plants die, and you can get your harvester in and collect all the potatoes. Simple. No brain power needed. It's very, very simple. And that kind of system was so introduced that you had, of course, as a result, a lot of prophylactic use of these control products as well. Whether you needed it or not, the chemical was put on. Oh, no, I wanted to not go there yet. Oops. There was also another component to it. People generally had basically the attitude of a zero tolerance to the pest. That meant as soon as the pest was found, bang, no matter what. If you have potatoes and you have your Colorado potato beetle in there, you only needed one darn specimen in there, and you will pick up the phone and call your pesticide applicator, and he either comes over by tractor or he flies over with a helicopter and sprays the hell out of it. Okay, that was the way it was done. The advantage also was that there was very low labor cost involved. It was far lower. You have huge fields, and you just have a guy that sprays, and you can sit back and do other things as farmer. Okay, you don't want to be exposing yourself to these chemicals, so you hire, farm laborers. Why not? Low knowledge base was a requirement, and did allow for high density cropping and monocultural practices. And I should say, though, with this consistently high yields at low cost, I forgot to mention, generally also very high quality. Here in North America, we have enjoyed excellent high quality food for 50 years or more. That is a smaller percentage of our entire disposable income than virtually anywhere else in the world. I should also mention that many of these chemicals and drugs that were developed first in the 1930s, but particularly after the Second World War, that these ones have been responsible for the elimination of a great deal of famine crises in parts of the world. I remember when I grew up that at times in the 1960s where you sometimes heard of these massive famines that would still occur in places like India and in China. Well, we don't hear about these anymore. And that is largely prevented because of the use of effective controls of pests and diseases through the use of chemicals. So we have to be careful in how we criticize these things. Um, it is of course wonderful if we could all use less of these chemicals. But I recall when I used to live in Africa in the 1980s, um, I have been to subsistence farmers and people that have a tiny little plot of land where that's the only source of food that they have. And you ask these people whether or not they would like to have access to some of these modern agricultural practices and products to make their crops better. And there is no hesitation there because they know that they often face terrible crop failures, either because of disease or because of some pests. I'm sure that most of you must have heard about the locusts that are raiding many parts of well, basically the Horn of Africa, in Somalia and in Ethiopia and Kenya. Um, Devastation as a result of the locusts. And the problem is that there is not enough control materials available and infrastructure available to actually stop these locusts. So there is a price to pay, however, for the business of using these chemicals. And I like this photograph to use in this presentation because this conventional, this that had become the standard since the 1950s, is this spraying of some chemicals. And here you have a beautiful field. I think it is a field of soybean, but I'm not sure. From here all the way to the horizon. One crop, one type of crop. Well, nature never designed it that way. Nature designed it in different way, but with of course, a much greater diversity of plant materials to cover the soil. In this case, everything is the same. As a result of it, you will have far greater input costs and products in order to keep it productive. So here, if you have the introduction of one pest, well, you have to make sure that it is eliminated promptly so that your crop is not jeopardized. Okay. The same thing applies for the fertilizers that are needed. Since there is only one set of nutrition that this particular crop demands, it depletes the soil of some of these nutrients. So you rely more heavily on the steady application of fertilizers. And so there are all kinds of negatives out there that are associated with these modern agricultural techniques. And it is interesting that in the 1960s and 70s, we would look at this picture and say, my God, it is a sign of progress. Look at this fabulous production and everything else. We were not really thinking about all the negatives because they were not really apparent, because we could solve the problems like this. Today, we have different lenses. We start to look at this and go, oh, look at this. It is all monocultural practice. And of course, in order to keep that going, you need a big a chemical application on there. So things have definitely changed. So here are some of the negatives associated with this modern technology that is being used. And much of that is that as similar to antibiotics that we have used in beehives, the broad spectrum pesticides that have often been used kill everything. They kill the good, the bad, and everything else in between. And what I mentioned earlier, if you continue to use the prophylactic drugs, such as antibiotics prophylactically, then you end up with the potential, as what I mentioned here, the pollen grains cannot be cracked open, and so the bees have a potential for nutritional deficiencies. We also have reduced the immune system. If the drugs are there almost all the time as a background, all the time, your immune system is no longer having to be primed to respond to these negative or these bad microbes or any of the microbes. So, in other words, you start to increase your dependency, whether you are raising livestock out in the whatever crop you're growing, you increase your dependency on drugs and chemicals. And of course, it stands to reason that if you use it all the time, that you also end up with greater or the development of resistant strains. Now, with the resistant strains, what mostly happens typically is that the farmer says, "Oh, well, I better start to put in more frequency. I'm going to apply the chemical more frequently." Not only that, you pick up the phone, you talk to the drug company or the chemical company and say, "You know what, your stuff is no longer effective. I need something better." So they will develop something that is generally in the trend of greater toxicity. It becomes more dangerous. And when it becomes more dangerous, it means it is more effective in killing whatever is there. Not only the target pest, but other pests or other insects, unrelated ones as well. And that is where the worry comes in. So here we are talking about something that has already been discussed or been recognized many, many years ago, particularly with the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, that you're dealing with the chemical treadmill. You become so totally ingrained into the use of these products that you can no longer afford not to use them. It becomes more and more toxic. So what they have done, recognizing the toxicity, they have then also developed certain chemicals, and particularly in insecticides, to say we have to narrow the scope in which we apply these products and how these products how they act. And that is what happens, for example, with neonicotinoids. Okay? I don't want to specifically go into neonicotinoids because then we are talking about it for the next couple of hours. It is important to understand this particular table out here. And here it is also called then the rate of diminishing returns of control inputs. And forget the numbers on the vertical axis out here. Don't worry about that. But I'd like you to imagine here that the red line represents, let's say, the number of varroa mites in your colony. Okay? And down below the horizontal bar is each number is representing a number of inputs, whatever they may be, a chemical or a drug or your whatever steps you undertake to diminish or eliminate the pest, in this case the varroa mites. So if you look at this horizontal bar, you will then see that when you are putting, let's say, two units of inputs to control inputs from 1 till 3, okay, look at how effective that control is. That population just tumbles all the way down. It's highly effective. You add another one to it, and that population of varroa mites is eliminated even more so. But you also see that with every additional step of controlling the pest, do you see that the rate of decline of the varroa mite is starting to get lower, less and less and less. So in other words, the first 3 or 4 inputs that you have put in were very effective. But these 4 inputs that you have put in the first thing, if you say from 10 to 14, look at how effective that is. You only reduce the pest population marginally. Okay, so that is the rate of diminishing returns, and that is really important. And that is why this reflects back on the futility of the whole zero pest tolerance level. This is important to remember. Oh, by the way, before I say that further, if you keep on adding more inputs to control the pest, What happens out here at point 17 there? Means there, the varroa mite in this case has been eliminated completely. It's eradicated. But it is equally likely that at such a high rate of, of, of inputs, you probably killed the bees as well. So there is one certainty with controlling the pest, that if you add more and more chemical to it to control, truly eradicate the pest, you end up probably killing the host as well. So the whole idea is that with the futility of zero pest tolerance means when I'm out there, if I only find one mite, I have to apply the chemicals to it. With the integrated pest management approach, you say, hold on for a second. Why should we fuss about having to eliminate the single mite out here when virtually everything is low enough anyway? In other words, maybe a little bit of mites in my colony, I don't have to worry about it. Okay. But the question is, of course, how much? It is just, I like to show the photograph out here, of course, with a worker bee and a dreaded varroa mite on her thorax. So the integrated pest management, and I will get to this now, the integrated pest management started in the 1950s in recognition of the ever more serious and toxic insecticides that were introduced. And so in the United States, some of the extension services started to insist of having, so we say, supervised applications or supervised controls of these products, recognizing that some of these products were pretty toxic. Okay, and one of the ways to do that is they started to recognize that they had to do a lot of monitoring, regular pest monitoring, and that will allow you to assess what is going to happen to the population, not only of the pest, but also in relation to your host, be it bees or be it cows or be it whatever is affected by this pest. Okay? And it is this understanding about the population dynamics and the trends that may take place, which is a key component in the integrated pest management program or integrated pest management system. And here, as we started out with, as the name would suggest, about integrating the different controls to make them all tick and fuse together and click with each other, you have basically a very carefully timed application of various controls. They can be cultural controls, chemical and drugs, and other techniques to complement and help each other so that you can effectively control the varroa mite, for example, or whatever other pest you're dealing with. There are 6 principles. Also, there are six principles involved in this. That is again the tolerance levels to the pest. You know, how much should you tolerate instead of a zero tolerance? And you can do a whole bunch of preventative cultural practices. I can go through all of those, the chemical controls or mechanical controls, monitoring, chemical controls, and biological controls. So, threshold, or the level, the threshold level. As you can see here, we have, and I will show you this paragraph or this slide out here shortly. You have 2 ones to consider in, let's say, and let's use varroa mites as an example. Okay, you have the economic threshold level and you have the economic injury level. The economic threshold level is basically you do these tests and you find out, oh, I have some mites. Okay, and according to the literature, according to previous research, if the mites are above this level, I better start applying some control, some chemical control. If it is below that level, I will wait. I don't have to apply the chemical yet. Okay. If it hits the economic injury level, that is when you may not, even when you apply the control product, you may not be successful. Maybe there has already been so much damage done on the bees, for example, that yes, you can try to apply it, but you have a good chance, not a certainty, but a chance that the bees won't make it anyway. Okay? And this is really important because I know from the inspection services we have here in British Columbia that unfortunately still a lot of beekeepers don't recognize the economic injury level. Okay? So, and it is then schematically on a graph what I just mentioned. When you have here the mite population, it is the early part of the spring, and it starts to rise very slowly. When you don't do anything, no testing, no nothing, whatever, until finally by the end of the season, after you've taken the honey off, you say, oh God, I better put some control into it, control the mites. And then you apply something. And of course, the result of it is that the mites will tumble down and may even disappear altogether. This graph could also represent a complete collapse of the colony. That is to say, it has steadily gone up and up and up and up, and at one point the colony is so burdened by it all that the entire colony collapses with the mites, and the whole thing comes down and falls down onto the basement. Yeah. So that is the yellow line. When we pretend, okay, that this is the 5% level of that is the injury level, and below that, of course, is an economic threshold level, somewhere in there. Okay. What this means is that if you would have your colony and you do regular tests, you see that these things are starting to rise very slowly. And that is why I have said before, you should manage your colony by testing them every 4 to 6 weeks, okay? From the spring onward. You go in there and you test and you say, well, there's just a few mites in here. That is just fine and I don't have to do anything. And when finally it comes to that close to this economic threshold level, then you better start to apply something. And as you can see, the orange will cause the mite population to go down a bit, and it keeps on going a little bit, and you manage to control it altogether. Okay. At the economic injury level out here, that is the 5% level, unfortunately that is what it is. As you can see, that you get, it's getting too high. I apply the product, okay, and let's say you do your test out here and you finally have your 5%, or you say, oh, it is well over 5%. Now you apply your product. Two things could happen. You may be able to salvage the bees, and basically the mite population goes down and it joins the orange line. That is one scenario. The other one is that because it has gone above the economic injury level, that really the bees are so injured that no matter what you do, that the bees will die and the whole colony will die anyway. Okay. So the problem with the economic threshold level and the varroa and the injury level, at least when it comes to varroa, unfortunately, is very, very low. You may recall I mentioned that in the previous presentation on diseases and pests. The economic threshold of varroa is only 3%. 3%, which is very low. You may recall I had the jar with the line in it with 300 bees. Please use that as a standard management monitoring tool, and every 4 weeks or every 6 weeks you do that. Okay, and so the first time you do the test in March or when the weather is good enough, and you say, there are only 2 mites in there, not a problem, because with the 300 bees and at 3%, it means that I can manage up to 9 mites, 10 mites perhaps. If 10 is easier to remember than 9. So as long as it is below, let's say 9 or 10, I'm safe because that will be representing 3%. If it hits the 3%, then you better start applying a product. And then, of course, you have your orange, and it will go down again. If you keep on testing and the thing, you're not doing anything, and you wait until August, and then finally said, oh yeah, I better do some controlling here. Basically, it's often too late. And that is not only too late because of the varroa mites damage that it has caused, but also the viruses that come along with it. Okay. We have also here preventative cultural practices, and that is another thing that is really worth knowing. Well, inspections prior to shipment, that is obvious for those that sell queens or bees to other beekeepers, and that is done on the basis of, or for that matter, big movement of colonies from one province to another. That is happening out here in British Columbia a lot, where all these colonies are inspected before they can come into the province and when they leave the province to go back to their home province. We don't inspect every colony, of course. With many of the commercial beekeepers, and there are some 40,000 of these colonies brought into the province every fall, before they return, we do a cross-section. According to a certain statistical model, we inspect a certain percentage of these operations. And if that is all looking pretty good and clean, then we give them the inspection reports, and their home province will then issue a permit for the import of bees into that province. Okay. Clean hive tools. I mentioned it before, and please believe me, it is washing your hands and doing all this stuff is remarkably effective, even without chemicals. It's just a matter of doing this regularly. Have always a jerry can or a tub of water with you when you're out there in the field to wash your hands regularly, to clean your tools, things of that kind. It really works. And if you find some effective equipment, don't be cheap and hold on to it. No, get rid of it. Okay, and replace it with good, clean, or brand new equipment. Mechanical controls. Take for example here, electric fencing. A bear, here in British Columbia, just about everywhere, except a few little pockets, it is bear country. We have bears everywhere. And when bears do get a flavor of knowing where the beehives are and destroy a beehive, boy, you're going to lose a lot of bees and a lot of equipment, because they don't do that in a genteel way. They really they toss things over and start chewing on the frames and everything else. So a good electric fence is a fantastic mechanical device to prevent bears to move into the apiary. Okay, and please do this before you even put honeybee colonies in there. What is far better, you put in an electric fence in your forested area and you have it operational before you even have put honeybee colonies there. The bears, they may smell there's a human has been out there, they come out to check it out, and they lose interest very quickly. Okay? When you can put your bees in there, they may still come back, but the electric fence may well deter them effectively. When a bear has been rewarded with a food reward by visiting and raiding your apiary, it's too late to put up a bear fence. You have to move the entire apiary out, because the bear will know breaking through the fence is cost effective because there's food on the other side. Okay. Screened airflows, did this for in wintering facilities, trapping devices, all these kind of things can play a complementary role in preventing the bees to suffer. So monitoring. Now monitoring is really one of the key activities of integrated pest management. As I mentioned before, particularly with varroa and viruses and American foulbrood disease, get into your colonies on a regular basis. And many good beekeepers, unfortunately not enough beekeepers do it. They have often right underneath or on top of the inner cover, they have a little sheet of paper, and they have a crayon, and they write down what they have seen or what they do. Every time they see this colony, they note, put a note down. Don't write a novel. Just write down queen, okay, or you can even shorten it. Q, okay, or needs more brood, or whatever. Food, things of that kind. Okay? And in that case, you have a record of what has happened. If you then do a test with your jar for measuring the amount of mites in your colony, okay, write it down. As much when you have on a monthly basis, if you have a record that says, and you remember the 9 or 10 mites per test, right? It says 2, fine. It says 5 next time, a month later, it says 5. It's okay. Then a month later, it says 65. Now you know that it's going through what we call the exponential growth curve. And that means disaster if you don't do something. That is the time to apply it. Whether you have honey on there or not, you cannot afford to lose your livestock. Too many beekeepers leave it. So what they do, they have in April that they apply some chemical to it to control mites, and they forget about mites altogether until late August, and then they take the honey off. And after they have taken the honey off, then they put it in a control. It's too late. Okay? So monitoring is key of getting an understanding about the population dynamics between the honeybees and the varroa mites. Okay? And what I said earlier, use the same detection technique. Don't use different methods because then you have no means of really measuring what's going on. If you use a different methods, it's just almost like in one case you're getting your results in miles, and another one you will get it in kilometers. It's kind of hard to mash these things together. So do it consistently. Okay? The great advantage of doing it on that basis is that you get not only a quantitative measurement, in other words, knowing how many mites there are in a beehive, for example, but also qualitatively. Qualitatively means you get now a measure as to how this progresses, these populations, over time. And that is a key thing. Just a quantitative measure is very weak because it is only a singular measurement at a particular time. By extending it over a longer period of time, doing it on a monthly basis, you will get a much richer picture as to what is actually going on inside of this colony. Okay? Unfortunately, IPM requires a higher knowledge base. You have to become familiar with the life cycles and the behavior and so on of both the pest and the host. How do they interact? What are the time periods of the brood cycles, for example? When would be, for example, with varroa mites, what time or what stage in its development or in its life cycle is she or is the pest most vulnerable? Well, we know that. What is the most vulnerable Achilles heel, if you will, of the varroa mite? Well, we know from a biology that we have, that we know, is that it depends. In order for it to reproduce and be successful, it must have access to honeybee brood. It cannot reproduce without the presence of honeybee brood. This is a vulnerable spot for it. So for you as a beekeeper to apply control products at this precise time when the mites are most vulnerable means that you have to use far less or product or less frequently and with the greatest efficacy. Okay? So you have to really get a feel as to what is actually going on. Okay? And you project that all based on your record keeping, and you get a much better idea about the population trends. Timing is critical. Don't use prophylactically by saying, oh, it's October, I might as well just put in the chemicals together with the sugar syrup. Don't do it that way. Only apply it when needed. Well, how do you know you need it? Well, you do these tests on a regular basis. Okay. ambient temperature. And I use this, for example, with formic acid. You cannot use formic acid when it gets at 12 degrees Celsius or lower, because naturally bees will start to cluster and become tighter and tighter as the temperature drops. When you then apply formic acid, you can kill the bees, at least the outer layer, and you don't treat the bees inside. Okay. I recall many, many years ago, that was in the early 90s, when beekeepers had to learn to deal with varroa mites. There was a beekeeper who called me he called me actually in late March, but he said, well, in late January, I inspected my apiary, winter apiary, and he had 100 colonies in there, about 100 colonies. And he said out of the 100, there were only 4 of them that had failed, 6 of them that had failed. They were dead. So there was a 6% winter loss or something like this. And he was happy. All the other all colonies looked very healthy and good and strong and so on. So as a good measure, he added a pollen patty to it, a pollen patty. And that is, of course, consists of protein and amino acids and everything else. And that is a strong stimulant for brood rearing. So the bees responded to that and started to rear brood. And then he called me late March. And he said, I had these and these things in January, and right now I have only something like 5 colonies left. All the others are dead. He said, what happened? So we went through the process of what he had done. So what he had done, according to our recommendations, he had applied formic acid in late summer, in August. And he subdued the mite population. And he thought, well, I've done my dirty deed, and now I can go home, and later on in October I will put the sugar syrup on and all this stuff to get them ready for winter. What were the mistakes? The mistakes were that in late August, after the formic acid treatment, he had not tested as to whether his treatments were effective. That's one thing. But even if they would have been effective, he forgot one important and critical thing, is that when he finished with his mite treatment with formic acid, that would take about 3 weeks. So in the middle of September to late September, the bees were cleaned of all these varroa mites. But guess what happens? We often have fantastic weather in October. Not always, but sometimes we still have beautiful flying weather for the bees. And they keep on flying. And they also keep on visiting each other. And they are transferring mites with them from other infected colonies. It means that his colonies were heavily reinfested with varroa mites in the late or in the middle of the fall season. And the total number of mites that may have wintered with these colonies may not have been that large. But all the mites that were wintering with the bees were phoretic bees. In other words, they were sitting on the adult bees, because the conditions were not for them to, they had no access to bee brood because there was no bee brood in the colony. So by the time January rolled around, the bee colonies were still in good shape. And when the pollen patty was put on, the bees were stimulated and started to produce brood. Well, that small patch or the small number of varroa mites, it didn't take them long to be attracted to the developing bee brood and started to parasitize it. On a percentage basis, one could assume that virtually all of the bee brood in early season was parasitized. And every subsequent bee brood cycle, was parasitized. So proportionately, that colony was heavily impacted by the few mites that managed to survive the winter. And by the time March rolled around, and I'm not even talking about the viruses that may have accompanied all of this as well, the wintered bees that were born in September, by that time they are at the end of their lives. They have to be replaced. They can no longer look after brood very well. So it started to tumble down. You had from one disaster after another, and by late March, The beekeeper had no longer too many bees left. Okay. So what should he have done? Well, what he should have done is exactly the first part. He did his formic acid treatment in the late fall, and then he should have tested to see whether or not what he did was effective. And then he should have done another test, let's say around middle of October. And then he should have said, hey, I still have too many mites in there. Now I can no longer use formic acid because formic acid can only be used when it is warmer weather of a minimum of, we recommend generally 15 degrees Celsius or higher. If you are somewhere around 12 to 15, you can do it and apply it only at the warmest time of the day, okay? But you have to start to become really careful with it. But in late or middle of October, you probably don't have these temperatures like that anymore out here. So then the alternative application could have been oxalic acid, as what is described in one of these bulletins, or some of these proprietary products like Apivar or Apistan or whatever. And then you leave that in for 6 weeks. So you mark the calendar and say, okay, there are too many mites in it. I put the darn controls in, these strips in, let's say middle of October. And that means 6 weeks later, by December the 1st, I have to pull these things out. And then you are pretty sure and secure that your colonies will have virtually no mites, if any mites left. Okay? So it is a timing issue that is really critical. You have to, it has often been said in beekeeping, what you do today or what you don't do today has an impact 6 months from now. Okay? And sometimes it is shorter than that. It's not even taking 6 months. So, of course, also use only approved products and follow label instructions. Don't put in an extra spoonful for good measure, or for that matter, say, oh, that is bloody expensive. Forget it. I'm going to use half a spoonful. It's often not going to work that way. Okay. In fact, underdosing is a strong stimulant for resistance development of the pest. So always follow the recommendations according to the labeled instructions. Okay. And I said, inspect and monitor and determine the efficacy of the product after the treatment is completed. Critical. Monitoring is critical. Then there is also another thing that is the last component of it, that is biological controls. And here you have the genetic traits. We are working hard, it has been worked hard here on the Varroa sensitive hygiene, or the VSH strains of bees. Yes, they do display an elevated level of tolerance or resistance to mites. Generally, these strains cannot be maintained in their pure form because of the influence of drones or genes that come from the area in which you operate your bees. Okay. Another component has to do with the hygienic impulse in dead brood removal. Some bees are far stronger and better at controlling or cleaning house compared to others. And I can use another thing for biological controls. For example, you have Acacia formosa. It is just a tiny little wasp that is used in greenhouses to control whiteflies. And whiteflies, of course, feed on hothouse tomatoes, and they themselves don't cause much damage, but it is the transmission of plant viruses, deadly plant viruses, that dictate that whiteflies have to be controlled. So instead of spraying the hell out of each of these greenhouses, what they do is they use a tiny little insect and wasp called Encartia formosa, whose single determination in life is to feast on whiteflies. So that is a very effective control mechanism. Another one is, for example, BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. This is a soil bacterium that is very common in the soil, and actually it is an approved product in organic farming. It is a naturally occurring bug, and it causes damage and it produces a natural poison, if you will, that affects cabbage loopers and other members of the Lepidopterans that damage cabbages and basically the cabbage family. It doesn't affect honeybees because the chemistry in the digestive tract of bees is very different, and therefore BTK or BT is fine around bees. I just like to mention it because there is currently some movement taking place to get it approved in some formulation of BT or Bacillus thuringiensis for the control of wax moth in stored beehive equipment. There are some developments taking place on that score. A successful integrated pest management system can only be done successfully with the bees having optimum nutrition, that you manage these colonies well without a lot of stress, that you use, of course, not lousy equipment that leaks and allows the wind to flow in, but that you have nice solid equipment, and of course that you as a beekeeper, that you are realistic in your expectation of what your bees can do. And I'm saying that largely because beekeepers often are highly unrealistic in their expectation of what bees can and cannot do. We're all optimists, but we have to be realists as well. And I had a conversation with one of you by email to do with, it's interesting, when you hang around beekeepers long enough, you notice that some of them are becoming, they're very strong in their opinions, but sometimes a little bit short in fact. So some of them say, oh man, I have a set of queens, man, they're just dynamite. They're unbelievable. They lay 1,500 eggs, some of them even close to 2,000 eggs a day. Really? 2,000 eggs a day? Well, it's interesting if you calculate this. How many minutes are there to the day? 1,440. I looked it up. I don't know these things just offhand, but so 1,540. So if she would lay 2,000 eggs a day, it means that she would have to lay an egg every 43 seconds, day and night. Well, if you come on a nice sunny day, a warm day, when it is ideal for the queen to be very active in sometime in the springtime, and you sit back out there on a beautiful day, you open up the hive and you start to look at that queen for a while, guess what? You see that she is not laying so many eggs every 43 seconds. In fact, she rumbles around and walks around quite a bit. She may lay an occasional egg while you're visiting the hive, the colony. Beekeepers have a tendency to overstate things, so think about it yourself critically about some of these, the information that you gather. And I don't even dare to start talking about the internet. There are some YouTube things that are entertaining, but it's not entirely really valid. Be critical in what you're seeing and what you're hearing. The drawbacks of integrated pest management, there is no question about it. It is higher labor inputs and more work, and certainly initially you would have less profitability to your beekeeping activity. It requires knowledge. You have to study. You have to start to get a feel of the interaction of host and pest. And what I just said, you have to analyze the information and strategize, how do I do this most effectively with the least damage or the least contraindicators? What are the benefits? These are the ones that we all want to have. Environmentally sustainable. There are much lower risks in contaminations and in things of that kind, adulterants. You're not dependent on the continuous usage of chemicals and drugs. And over time, you will have healthier bees, stronger bees, and more productive bees. And again, I invite you to really remember one of the things I said before on one of the other sessions. The best beekeepers in the world are the bees themselves. They know how to keep themselves healthy. But they need a bit of help because of all the enemies that they now face. So in order to be as successful at this as possible, the phrase epicentric beekeeping is one that has been introduced by a well-known researcher, a legendary researcher from Cornell University by the name of Dr. Tom Seeley. And he came up with this this interesting phrase, an epicentric beekeeping. And I strongly support that. That means that you are managing your colonies by taking advantage of the innate strengths and the natural tendencies that bees have to look after themselves. Okay, that's why when I was talking a week ago or 2 weeks ago about you importing queens from New Zealand and Australia, these are queens that are in the season, were brought in a very different time of the year, in August to September, in seasons wise. Okay, that is when bees don't produce queens. And we insist on producing queens at that time. Well, the result of it is when they come out here, they're not performing often, not always, but often they do well, but quite often there's quite a high percentage that fail. Okay. What about when is the best time? The most quality, high quality queens that you can ever get? Typically at the time that they are naturally inclined to produce them. Swarming season, that is when the colony is ready to produce a whole bunch of queens. These queens, over millions of years, bees have learned that these are the best queens. Okay? April and May. Physiologically, the bees are ready, okay, to produce fine quality stock. So it is emulating, trying to fit our management cycle into the natural cycle of the world of bees. Then you become a really good beekeeper. It's not easy, but it is very rewarding when you do that. The last picture is always a pretty one. Okay? Let me just see how this goes, and I can take this out again. Let me see how this works. No, I shouldn't have done that, obviously. It will be. So now we're going to go into this again. No, I have to do something else here. Hold on for a second. My apologies. And to the slideshow, yes, indeed. Okay, there we go. I'm sorry, I have to. There we go. Fall and winter. What is it? Oh, it is right now 17 minutes after 10 o'clock. What about if we take a 5-minute break and then we will talk about fall and winter preparations and feeders, okay? And I also want to talk a bit about bee legislation. So we'll see you in 5 minutes, okay? All right. Fall and winter preparation. I had sent you earlier a number of some photographs with, sorry, I'm just looking at what I have to get it onto the full screen again. Let me just make sure that I do. We'll see what happens now. Yeah, there it is. I hope it stays this way. No. I'm sorry, I have to just look at what it is doing. Winter preparation. You have of course the need for feeding the bees occasionally, and for that in the springtime. And quite often beekeepers use plastic frame feeders, and these are basically inserted right inside of the brood chamber and filled with sugar syrup and then provided to the bees. Mostly you need, in the frame feeder, you need a floating device. It can be a stick, it could be some grass, something on which the bees can stand. If you just fill it up with sugar syrup, piles of bees will just drown into the syrup, defeating the very purpose of it. So I would recommend that you use, if you want to use a frame feeder, that you have a floating device sitting right in it. I don't like these feeders at all because they are essentially taking up a lot of space. They are not very convenient in terms of size, and they tend to be taking up too much room. And often you have to squeeze your frame feeder in there or to pull it out. It's very inconvenient. The other drawback of it is that when you are using it, that every time again you use it, you need you have to open up the entire colony in order to gain access to it. Really inconvenient in my view. So I would recommend that you use it minimally, and most of the time it is used in the springtime when you have need for small amounts of sugar syrup to be put in there. Okay. What I prefer far more is to do either the top feeder or the pail feeder. And I mentioned this earlier, that the pail feeder is excellent, where you end up having a food grade pail with a lid on it, and you can cut out the center part of the lid by 3 inches or something, and then you put on the inside with a glue gun, you can put in some very fine nylon mesh material. Some people asked about, hey, mosquito netting for windows, would that work? No, it won't work, because the holes are too large and your sugar syrup will drip straight through it. You need something finer than that. Okay. And then if you put and it is a small little bucket, you don't have to be a large one, and you fill that up with sugar syrup, and you can close it off, and you put it upside down, and you put that right on top of the inner cover, and the bees will just lick up the sugar syrup when it comes to the holes of the screen. Okay. Now, the thing is that what the illustration also shows, you have then an empty box that you can put around it as a chimney, if you will, to protect the inverted bucket, and then you put your lid on top of that. So all what you do is, after a while, when you notice from, oh, I better have a look, is how, oh yeah, it's right above the hole, of course, of the inner cover. When it is empty, you can check that readily. You can fill up the bucket, put it back on again. And it is particularly useful when you are fall feeding, where you have to put in the sugar syrup as fast as you possibly can. Okay? So now, the other thing is the Rolls-Royce edition, and that is the top feeder that there is a display on that photograph as well, where you have essentially a dedicated piece of hive equipment where it's all lined on the inside with a heavy, well, basically a veneer, if you will, to make it, to seal it off. And then you see inside you have the chimney where the bees can walk up, and then they walk down and they can take the liquid out that way. It's a nice thing. You can put your lid on top of all of it. The drawback of it is that most of the season you don't need to do that. Okay, you don't need all that material, and so you have to store it. And you have to store it somewhere where extra equipment, and it is more expensive. But you can use it for those that like to play with these things. So after you have taken your honey off in the fall season, what happens? Then you will have to get into prepare winter preparation. Some people like this idea of leaving the honey on for the winter. That's entirely your choice. You can do that, or some people do it for sentimental reasons. They take most of the honey off, but a little bit of honey they leave on. All these things are fine. Um, Often the question comes up, well, what can I then feed the bees instead? Well, the problem is the high fructose corn syrup that some people have been promoting, and there are some difficulties with that. The high fructose corn syrup is, of course, a chemically derived sugar source or carbohydrate source from corn, because corn consists of polysaccharides, all these long chains of sugars, and through enzymatic activity and from chemical activities, they break that down in small little segments, and these becomes glucose or and sucrose. So you have monosaccharides and disaccharides that are then fed to the bees. The problem with it is that if it is used at a temperature that is a bit too high, then you end up basically with a particular byproduct that is toxic to bees. It's called hydroxymethylfluorol. And this product can be deadly to bees. And so when you would get into the high fructose corn syrup business, you have to make sure that it is with specifics in it, that it has very low HMF values. There are also beekeepers who say, oh, well, yeah, I like to have organic sugars and natural sugars, whatever. That is all very fine, except there is a problem to that. Most of the natural or organic sugars are ones that have residues in them, plant residues. And although we like them because they taste better, they have a richer flavor, the drawback of that is that these products have a tendency to be, these plant residues are non-digestible to bees. And when bees are confined to the hive for a long period of time, for the winter season, if they get a buildup of these non-digestible products inside of their digestive system, they will start to develop diarrhea, and they can at one point can no longer hold on to it. And guess what happens? They become, they basically defecate inside of the hive with all the dire consequences. So we therefore recommend use refined sugar. And refined sugar is either coming from cane sugar or from beet sugar. Okay? That has proven to be the most trouble-free form of sugar for winter feed. Okay? I hope that, okay, and then when you are in the fall season, how much do you feed the bees? Well, that is somewhat subject to, depending on where you are located. If you are located here in the coastal British Columbia, you don't need nearly as much as when you are in the Peace River district. But something like about 40 kilos or roughly 80 pounds of sugar syrup is generally needed. And when you do that in the fall, you try to feed them quickly. Don't spend months doing this. You feed one bucket after the other as fast as you can. The bees will take that in very quickly, and then suddenly you notice that they stop doing it. And that is when they are kind of, they no longer want it. Then you can take everything off, and you can put your hive to bed, so to say, for the winter season. Now, what do you do then in terms of there's enough feed in it? What you do then is you can put your colonies closer together. So you may have two colonies side by side. And what you do is you can then prepare, you can wrap them with material if you think that is necessary. In many areas that is not, but most of the heat is lost at the top. So what a lot of beekeepers do is they build essentially a big pillow that is filled with fiberglass or with wood chips or with some other light fluffy material, and they seal that off, and this big plastic bag is put right on top of the lid. And if there are two hives together, they put that, make that pillow large enough to cover the surface area of the entire two colony units. Okay. Many of them put four colonies side by, two facing the other way and two facing this way. And the result of that is that you have a block of four. You can put one big pillow on that. And then you have a piece of plywood. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick plywood. And you put that over the pillow. And then with rope or with twine, you actually tighten it down. And so you have essentially a bit of an arched roof with the pillow right underneath it and the four colonies underneath that. They winter extremely well that way. Okay, so there are different ways of doing that, depending on the severity of the winter conditions. What I mentioned earlier, you have of course also the option for a bee house, where you create a three-sided structure where the bees will stay out of the wind and out of the snow and sleet and everything else altogether. And you can also put a pillow on top of that. And I distributed that photograph earlier. Bee legislation, oh dear Lord, bee legislation. I don't want to spend a great deal of time on this because it's a boring topic for most of you. There is at the federal level not very much stuff going on as to how you have to deal with mites or with the government on bee legislation. The federal government is primarily involved in a few things. The import of bee stock from outside of the country falls under CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They are the ones that issue permits in case you have decided to buy stock or bees or queens from an approved source. And there are a number of sources we have available: New Zealand, Australia, Chile, Hawaii, and certain producers in California. Okay. For small-time beekeepers like you, or for most of you, I would recommend don't bother with all of this stuff for applying for an import permit and all this jazz. It's too much hassle with paper and cost and everything else. You might as well then order your queens or your bees from an established bee importer. And there are a number around here in Western Canada, in any other part of Canada or the United States as well. So that's the federal government. There's also, for chemical controls for products such as formic acid or Apistan or Apivar or some of these products, that falls all under the Health Canada control system. For chemicals, it is the PMRA. So it is Health Canada's PMRA, and the PMRA stands for the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. They deal with the registration of all farm chemicals, okay? Not just for bees, but for all kinds of other things too. PMRA. Under Health Canada, they also have the the Veterinary Drug Directorate, VDD, the Veterinary Drug Directorate. And such the products as oxytetracycline, Oxytet, that we have used in the past, that is under their jurisdiction. And so is the product that is used for controlling nosema. It's called Fumidil or Fumagillin. It all falls under the Veterinary Drug Directorate. The drugs and those are no longer available, with the exception of Fumagillin for nosema use. The drugs such as oxytetracycline and those are now only available through a veterinarian prescription. If you need to get more details about that, you can email me, or I can, some of that information is readily available now. Okay. So that is at the federal level. Here in Canada, the business about bees and apicultural programs are typically provincially controlled. There are in the federal government a number of research institutions and specialists that deal with bees. So we have the Agriculture Canada Research Station up in Beaver Lodge that is very dedicated to bees and bee research up in northern Alberta. And there are a number of researchers at the University of Guelph and here at the University of British Columbia. So there are quite a few researchers, but in different locations, and some of them are not federal at all. They are working for either for the university or for provincial governments. At the provincial level, we deal with the controlling the bee movement of from outside of the province into the province, and the whole business of the provincial legislation dealing with bees here in British Columbia falls under the so-called Animal the Animal Health Act. Okay, and there is a subsection dealing specifically with bees. It's called the Bee Regulation, and you can look that up under Google it for that matter, and you will find legislation in British Columbia, and you can have a whole list of these things, including the Animal Health Act. It's a big piece of legislation, and because of all animals fall under that, but a subsection of there or an addendum is called bee regulation. The purpose of that, including the legislated requirement for beekeepers to register with the Ministry of Agriculture, it's not because the Ministry of Agriculture has this hunger to be bureaucratic and busy with compiling names of knowing what beekeepers do or not do. We don't really care about that. It is recognized that it is a highly unregulated activity, and the main or the sole reason for the requirement for registration is to help beekeepers to control diseases and pests. Our apiculture program in British Columbia, we are very fortunate that we have a very strongly supported program that also includes inspection services free of charge to the beekeeper. We have laboratory diagnostic services free of charge. We have this course, we have education materials, extension materials, and on it goes. And all of that is to support beekeepers and ultimately to support the honeybee colonies and that are in the province. So the registration is a requirement, and you can do that online. You don't have to do anything except fill out the form, and you go from there. And it is on a renewal cycle of 2 years. So after 2 years, you get automatically a notice in the mail that says, please, update your registration. Or you can do that faster and do that more frequently if you want to. Okay. It also requires, we do these inspections, and I mentioned earlier for inspections that will come into the province, these bees that come into the province, we have reciprocal agreements with other provinces so that a honeybee or a beekeeper who wants to bring in his colonies from Alberta, let's say, the government of Alberta will inspect these colonies first, and on the basis of the test results that are sent to me, we issue a bee permit for the import of bees into the province. Okay. We also have to know where they are located, so you have apiary locations that are also registered, so in the event there is a mishap or some need for it, we can find the colonies and do inspections. Okay. So that is at the provincial level. And that is all geared towards supporting honeybee health. That's our purpose. Nothing else. So the whole business of post-production, let's say you finally got that honey in the barrel, now you want to sell that or you want to whatever you want to do, that's your business. We don't care about it. This honey in itself is not a very regulated food product. It is non-perishable under the right conditions, and therefore it doesn't pose a great deal of concern about safety or things like this. Okay. We also don't care about how much money you make, or for that matter, how much money you lose at producing honey. So I just wanted to separate these things out. So we are primarily involved with looking after the health of the bees. The one that you are probably most likely having to deal with in terms of legislation are bylaws. And bylaws are, at the local level. And I cannot speak for other provinces, of course, but in many provinces they have similar arrangements. Here in British Columbia, you have some cities and municipalities that have bylaws that permit beekeeping, and even Vancouver itself, which can be considered to be the most urbanized of all towns in British Columbia, they do permit beekeeping. But it is, of course, enshrined in a set of conditions that put some limits as to what you actually can do in beekeeping. And again, it can vary from municipality to municipality, but generally for a standard lot, they allow 2 honeybee colonies plus a couple of nucleus colonies temporarily, so that you don't over densify the local area with bees. There are sometimes problems to do with massive defecation in the early spring. That is mostly a temporary situation, but most of the time municipalities, particularly in the last few years, have become very receptive and see the value of having honeybee colonies in their midst. But it also requires beekeepers to basically be good beekeepers, to look after their colonies well. And I think it is an important thing to remember. What is most important is that not everybody in the world is in love with bees. So as I mentioned earlier, it pays to be kind of discreet about you don't have to be secretive, but you can certainly be somewhat discreet in your beekeeping activities so that you don't overexcite your neighbors who may be looking out of the kitchen window and say, oh, well, there he is. Look at what he's doing with all these bees. And it becomes then a focal point and often an irritation. So I would suggest be discreet. And what I mentioned earlier, you can color your hives in an earth tone color, in a green color, or in a nice brown color, or natural wood color, and they blend into the vegetation in your garden quite well. For those that live in rural areas, of course, there I also recommend the colonies to be in a natural color rather than white. Not only is that for temperature control a better option, but keep in mind that you also have less chance that your colonies are looked at for theft or for vandalism or for target practice or for whatever other reason. And sometimes it's good, that you have maybe a fence or a gate behind which you have your colony, so that not every Tom, Dick, and Harry can actually come out there. So there are some of these options are available. Okay. So that is the legislation, and there are also municipalities that tend to be silent on the matter. And what that means is that you end up having sometimes, what's happening here now? All right. What also can happen is that you end up with some of these municipalities being silent on it, and that means they don't regulate anything until there is a complaint. Sometimes new beekeepers approach me and say, how do I go about this? I said, well, you just look it up on the internet, look whether or not there is any rule or regulation in place, and if there is, see what they are. But if they are silent on it, meaning there is nothing on the books, you just start keeping bees. And I recommend then to keep bees more or less the way another city have it in its bylaws. So if you follow the bylaws of another town and you say this is the norm that they use, and you apply that to yourself, that if there is ever a complaint coming up, you can say, look, you don't have anything in the books, but I've been following the regulations that exist in the other city because they consider those to be acceptable and to be supportive and everything else. So you have something to stand on, okay, and to defend. It could well be, is what I have witnessed sometimes over the years, that you have still a an unpleasant envelope coming into the mail that says, "Thou shalt remove the bees from your property in a period of 2 weeks," and then you have to move them out of town. So that sometimes happens. If you have serious problems, feel free to give me a call or an email. And I have, over the few decades, I have dealt with numerous municipalities, and try to be patient with them. I mean, I know that some of the bylaw enforcement officers are big boys with big cap on their heads and labels and everything else, and they're very important. But generally speaking, if you can reason with them, there is often a good solution at the horizon. So I would like to see whether or not there are any questions, because we're coming to the end here, and um, let me see. Is there a calendar for the lower mainland that shows the approximate availability of pollen and nectar sources? Yes, there is, and I could email. Well, I could email everyone a long list of floral sources that are available, naturally available throughout the province. There are numerous sites right now. If you look at the botanical gardens at UBC, the UBC farm, I think they have a very beautiful list of flowering plants. Van Dusen Gardens have also a listing. There is generally quite a bit of stuff available. The main naturally occurring floral sources here in the Fraser Valley start, of course, with the hazelnuts in the earliest part, together with alder. These are very low quality, nutritionally low valued food sources, but the bees get excited because they can access to it. And that is mostly followed by dandelions, and of course bees love dandelions. And then you have, of course, your blueberries, and after the blueberries you often have a dip in the Fraser Valley, in the coastal British Columbia, until the blackberries come into bloom. And then from there on you go further, you have the cranberries, you have a variety of other sources available. Okay. If you go into the mountains, of course, fireweed is an important component. That can be very lucrative. It can be very beautiful honey. Fireweed honey is one of the finest honeys available. It is very light in color and very distinct in its aroma. But if you are a gardener at the same time, and I certainly encourage everyone to be that, try to focus on bee-friendly plants, plants that feed bees. And we have, of course, our government website. You have the website, it's our government website, and you, instead of apiculture, you put in food for bees, and there is a long listing of something like 30 or 35 different plant sources that are very beneficial to bees, not just to your honeybees, but also to wild bees. So, okay. Yeah, I don't know how to say it. Not so full sun on the left side. I am so sorry that I don't know how to, I've been fidgeting with this to get a full screen, and my apologies that it is not working the way I want it.